So a row is brewing between Afriforum and Cricket South Africa after Proteas wicketkeeper Quinton de Kock refused to abide by a mandated decision requiring all players to take the knee at the T20 World Cup games. De Kock has reportedly said that taking the knee is a token gesture that has been watered down to mean almost nothing. Afriforum says that it supports de Kock's decision and that the mandate will not pass constitutional muster. So, for more on this development and what we should think about, let's bring in Afriforum's attorney, Daniel Eloff, as well as diversity expert Asanda Ngoasheng. Both our guests joining us via our video link. And to both of you, thanks very much indeed for making time. It's lovely to have you on the program. Daniel, I wonder if I can begin with you. I mean, Afriforum, who you're representing, has come out strongly against this directive. Tell us why.
Well, quite simply because this is a matter of constitutional freedoms and liberties that were quite hard fought and come by. And what this simply boils down to is a matter of freedom of association, freedom of expression, and equality in treating everyone equally before the law. The biggest, I think, problem with mandating a decision like this is you sort of lose the moral and political value of the symbolism that Cricket South Africa is trying to achieve when you compel it. And that's the gist of the entire thing. The fact that Cricket South Africa, merely 2 hours before the Proteas game 2 days ago, mandated that all players should take the knee, really lost all of its political weight and its moral authority because it was compelled and because it was mandated.
So, to be clear, this is more about the fact that this has been made mandatory and less about the fact that Quinton de Kock has refused to abide by it.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the point is, for the past almost year and a half, the Proteas cricket team has treated the BLM movement, or players at least have treated it differently. I think people forget that. They think this is a new news story because it only sort of got national prominence now. But last year it was also a question when the BLM movement really gained a lot of momentum.
Right. And
there was a discussion about how Protea players reacted to it. Some took the knee, raised their fist in the air, some stood and raised their fist, and others just stood by. And I think that's perfectly acceptable. Players should be guided by their own personal conscience and not by the pieties of a sport governing body, who really, arguably, it's not their responsibility to try to enforce certain pieties.
Asanda, I wonder if you agree with that, the fact that sports bodies in some respects can be removed from the climate, for lack of a better term, as well as from, I guess, unavoidable conversations to be had, especially given what we know to have been taking place behind the scenes in cricket.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing I just want to clarify is that why do people take the knee in football matches, in cricket matches and sports matches? The reason is because it's a sign of respect and concern when someone is hurt. But more than that, it's about delivering absolute silence that signals to people understands that the injury is so serious and everyone should be concerned. So if you look at it from that context, why do people take the knee? It's to indicate hurt and the seriousness of the hurt. And so that sign then evolved to signify the hurt and the serious hurt that black people were feeling, particularly in the US, which then spread globally because there is a global solidarity movement against the domination of whiteness and a solidarity with black people all over the world who are still to this day suffering from the yoke of racial oppression. And so anyone that supports, that understands and stands against the racial oppression that black people continue to feel would not be making the statements that Eugene de Kock, through his lawyer, is making. Because there's also the question of positionality that needs to be taken into account. Who is Eugene de Kock? Does he suffer from racism? And by virtue of suffering or not suffering from racism, does he have a right to state or to decide which gestures are, real or not real? And so if you think about it from a perspective of somebody who suffers from racism, if they decide that this gesture is real, I mean, can you imagine if during the struggle somebody said, I'm not going to raise my fist in solidarity because it's a useless gesture? Where would we be? in this country. And so you have to take the context of South Africa. You have to take the context of where does taking the knee come from and the Black Lives Matter movement and what it stands for in order for you to be able to understand this. You can't just narrow it down to conscientious objection in the Constitution and therefore claim individual liberties that don't make sense when there is a bigger global concern that people are raising. And I just want to add lastly also that I have a serious problem with the idea that people representing a country that is majority black, that is still under the yoke of white supremacy to this day, think that they can have, individual liberties while representing a majority black country still suffering from the yoke of oppression, wherein they can say they don't think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea. I think it's great that Cricket South Africa realized that it was important that there was uniformity in the response, because the idea that some will kneel, and some will take the fist, some won't take the fist, it was a problem. And it's good that they were seeking uniformity because these people are representing South Africa, and South Africa is 90% plus black people who have been talking about racism, who have been talking about the yoke of racism, and who have been supporting Black Lives Matter. So I'm not sure which South Africa he represents, and maybe that's what he needs to give us clarity on. Right. And I'm not sure who gives him the right and what positionality gives him the right to decide which gestures are good or not. And in the same way that an ambassador takes instructions from South Africa, people who represent this country should be able to take instructions from South Africa. Otherwise, they shouldn't play for the national team, because to be in the national team is to agree to represent South Africa whether there's problems or not. That is why it's so important that there was uniformity.
Loud and clear. Asanda, and of course, just to put on the record, I think you meant Quinton de Kock whilst you were speaking there. I think you...
Sorry, yes, I didn't mean Quinton.
No problem. So let's bring you back into the conversation here, Daniel. I mean, how important is it? I'm sure on the basis of it, in principle at least, even Afriforum would agree that it's important to give a very clear anti-racism agenda, especially on the world stage, given South Africa's problems. Do you not think that something like the situation that the team itself had found itself in didn't do that? I mean, it's a point that you raised. The fact is, the team itself wasn't giving a uniformed message, and that's what, at least according to Cricket SA, necessitated making this mandatory.
Yes, indeed. And perhaps just one other point of clarification. I am not the attorney acting on behalf of Mr. de Kock, simply the representative of Afriforum in this matter. But regardless, I perhaps just want to quickly respond on 2 points. The first thing is, I think we need to be quite clear that taking the knee is not as a universally representative symbol of anti-racism as we might believe. The point is, it didn't simply flow from the sort of analogy that the previous speaker gave regarding bending the knee because a player is injured. It quite clearly started from the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, I think she was referring to, sorry to interrupt you there, I think she's just referring to metaphorical injury. I mean, this is not necessarily
No, I completely understand. Right. The point is, what I'm saying is, and this is exactly the point, is it's not as unambiguous as people would want you to believe. It's not morally as unambiguous. It's not symbolically as unambiguous. The point is, taking the knee is quite a politically loaded gesture. And the fact that it is politically loaded should tell you why you simply can't mandate it for any person or for all people, because it doesn't mean the same thing for every single individual. And the second thing I'd just like to comment on is the fact that it's always, I find it quite strange that we celebrate diversity in South Africa as long as it's diversity that people agree with. It's never diversity of thought. It's never diversity of association that we celebrate in South Africa. It's to be honest, quite superficial diversity, because it's only skin deep. We don't talk about diversity of thought. We don't talk about diversity of opinion in South Africa, and we don't value it. And the point is, taking the knee in sports in the entire world is not a simple question, and consequently, we can't simply mandate it. And perhaps just the last point I'd like to make. The fact that we use the analogy of an ambassador representing South Africa, well, the point is an ambassador is an employee of the South African government and has a very particular duty and role to fulfill, namely representing the country in foreign jurisdictions. A cricket player's primary objectives and primary job, and in fact this is what their contracts say, is they're there to play cricket to the best of their abilities.
But they are not there,
the country there as political representatives of South Africa.
They do represent the country, though. Many people would actually push back against that last point, and it's actually on that basis that
as sports stars.
But still, wearing the South African badge, they go out onto the pitch as people who are representing the values and ethos of the country that sent them there. They're not there in their personal capacities. In fact,
well, perhaps we can do a quick and interesting thought experiment. Would it be objectionable if Cricket South Africa mandates that every South African sports star should sing the Afrikaans part of the national anthem? Would that be acceptable for a sport governing body to do?
Well, I mean, those are... Okay, let me let Asanda come in and perhaps she'll respond to that. I think many people will admit that that's not necessarily the same thing. And even if that were to be the case, we're already living in a context where they do sing the national anthem, which in some respects is seen as a political statement that is allowed on the field. But Asanda, your part of the case.
Yeah, I think you've answered part one of what I was going to say, that the very fact that they have to sing the national anthem is actually an indicator that there are rules that they do prescribe to. And so it's quite disingenuous to come and say, you know, it's okay for them to sing the national anthem, it's okay for them to wear the South African colors, it's okay for them to raise the South African flag, but let's not pretend they are ambassadors. But I think, you know, his statement actually indicates something which I've always said, which is that the idea that we have allowed, you know, lack of diversity and representation in the cricket team, in the rugby team, and in many of South Africa's national teams is exactly the kind of thing that leads to this kind of thinking, right? Because if we had South African teams that were representative of the South African population, which is 8% white and 2% colored in Indian, and is, about 4% colored in Indian, and is 92% black, some of these problems that we're facing we wouldn't face. But we have created a situation in which the previously dominant racial group of South Africa, who during apartheid mandated themselves to be more superior and better than everybody else, people who happen to be white in this country now think that they can pick and choose which parts of South Africa they can and can't join, which parts of South Africa they can and can't be part of. And if you look at corporate and how BE, affirmative action, is implemented or not implemented, if you look at the fact that, there is absolutely no repercussions, absolutely no consequences for failing to implement the country's laws around affirmative action and black economic empowerment, then you get this kind of thinking, because now he's asking us, how dare the country have expectations of him? Well, we have expectations of anybody that represents this country to represent their values. And the idea that even if we agreed on every single thing, the idea that somebody can use the argument of individual liberties to try and go against a morally just movement, a morally just decision, just shows you that he actually isn't interested in what he claims to be interested in. Because if he was, he would at the very least find different channels to make the point. Right. He would be writing opinion pieces questioning the weight of the statement. He would be having conversations, maybe saying that, I'm not sure, I just want us to be clear on this. He wouldn't be deliberately, insistently refusing to abide by what the rest of his team have abided by. And I think that it's quite disingenuous, and it's whatabouterism, which is a problem with racism, right? That racism takes the thing that you put in place in order to fight against it, takes the very constitution you put in place in order to fight against domination and, absolute discrimination, and uses it against you. And This is what we have to guard against in South Africa, this constant abuse of the law, abuse of our institutions who are there to protect morally just decisions.
Asanda,
and I hope that they take this. I hope they take this to court. I hope they take this all the way to the Constitutional Court so that we can all have clarity. Because I think they're wrong, and I hope I hope that I am proven wrong at the Constitution, because then we need to have a conversation about who is morally just in the country and who the victims of racial oppression and domination are in this country and what we're going to do about it, instead of running around quoting individual liberties and obfuscating facts for our own nefarious means.
Yeah, I'm going to be in trouble for doing this, but Daniel, I have to give you an opportunity to respond very quickly if you can, please. In about 30 seconds, your response to that.
Sure thing. Well, perhaps just broadly speaking, I think it's horribly simplistic and collectivist thinking to believe that all South Africans agree that not taking the knee is suddenly quite a racist task. It really is quite simple, this entire debate. While we're focusing on these symbolic gestures or the lack of these symbolic gestures, Cricket South Africa is in disarray. Cricket South Africa is failing to transform the sport of cricket in the country. Cricket South Africa is failing at grassroots level to ensure that there's transformation. And the last point that I just want to make is, again, I really abhor the fact that we look at diversity and it's only skin deep, and we don't look at diversity on an individual level and consider every single person's political opinions, their own right and freedom to associate, because surely diversity is only meaningful when it can be considered on an individual level and not collectivist, on a collectivist manner.
Well, I'll tell you what, despite all the disagreements, I think we all agree on one thing. Diversity of thought doesn't necessarily mean that people are exempt from being critiqued from the decisions they make. To both our guests, thanks very much indeed for your time. Really do appreciate it. Asanda Ngoasheng is a diversity expert and Daniel Eloff is an attorney representing Afriforum.